The stock market just touched another all-time high, and it has literally never mattered less to the guy staring at it. Barron caught the headline on his phone this morning. S&P 500 closes at a record, sitting right underneath a text from his landlord announcing another rent hike. He turned the phone screen down and went back to his cereal. 3 floors above him, in the same building, Nikki saw that exact same headline. She didn't bother flipping her phone over. She just watched a number in her brokerage app climb by more than Barron earns in an entire year, took a sip of coffee, and carried on with her morning like nothing happened. Same city, same building, same words on the same screen. 2 completely separate universes. My name is Nick, and today we're tackling the question that's been quietly driving everybody up the wall. If the world genuinely feels like it's falling apart, if everything costs more and nobody can afford a home, then why does the stock market keep celebrating like nothing's wrong at all? This isn't a video about the market being broken or fake. It's about what that scoreboard is actually tracking and why it was never built to track you. So here's the first thing you need to get straight, and it's something almost nobody actually says out loud. The stock market is not the economy. I'm sure you've heard that line before, tossed around by talking heads on television, who then never bother explaining what it actually means. So let me really break it down. Picture the stock market as a massive scoreboard hanging above a stadium. Your gut instinct, and it's a totally reasonable one, is to assume that scoreboard reflects how the entire crowd is doing. It doesn't. It reflects how a tiny handful of players down on the field are performing. You're up in the stands. Most of us are up in the stands. And that scoreboard flashing green doesn't mean your seat got any comfier or your beer got any cheaper. It just means the players you paid to watch are having a phenomenal night. Once that image actually sinks in, the paradox stops feeling like a paradox and starts feeling kind of obvious. Because here's layer 2, and it's a big one. The stock market couldn't care less about right now. It never has. The economy, jobs, paychecks, the cost of a dozen eggs, whether your rent climbed again, all of that measures what's happening today. The stock market is a wager on what a small group of massive companies will be earning years down the road. It's not a thermometer, it's more like a fortune teller, and a fairly overconfident one at that. So when you're feeling broke today and the market rockets to a fresh high that very same afternoon, those two things aren't even describing the same slice of time. You're living your Tuesday. The market is betting on 2030. And here's the twist, it's not even betting on your version of 2030. Roughly 28% of all the revenue generated by companies inside the S&P 500 doesn't even come from inside the United States. It comes from overseas. For the massive tech names specifically, that figure jumps to over half. So take that board you keep nervously glancing at, the one you assume mirrors your neighborhood, your job, your corner grocery store. A huge chunk of it isn't measuring any of that whatsoever. It's tracking how many iPhones Apple moves across Europe and how many chips get shipped to server farms on the other side of the planet. Your rough Tuesday and a record-setting S&P 500 were never actually contradicting each other. They were never even on the same map to begin with. And if you want proof that the market and your real life can wander off in wildly different directions, just look at history. Back in early 2020, at the height of the pandemic, unemployment exploded to levels not seen since the Great Depression. People were legitimately terrified, and the stock market crashed for roughly a month, then flipped around and sprinted to brand new record highs while millions of people were still sitting jobless. Record highs and unemployment lines, holding hands at the exact same moment. It's happened before and it'll happen again because these two things were never measuring the same thing in the first place. Now, if I mentioned the market hit a record high, you'd probably imagine all 500 companies climbing together, a rising tide lifting every single boat. Nope, that's not what's actually going on either. Let me show you where this party is really happening because it's a much smaller room than you'd guess. There's a cluster of companies people have nicknamed the Magnificent Seven. Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, Amazon, Alphabet, which is Google, Meta, which is Facebook, and Tesla. 7 companies out of 500. And right now, those 7 names alone make up close to 32% of the entire index. Sit with that for a second. 7 names out of 500 are basically a third of the whole thing. Now, stretch it out to the 10 biggest companies, and you're looking at over 40% of the index resting on just 10 stocks. The last time concentration got anywhere near this extreme was the dot-com bubble back in 2000. and we've now sailed well past that level. So what does that actually mean for you? It means the S&P 500 is basically wearing a costume. It's dressed up to look like 500 diversified American businesses, but underneath it behaves like roughly 10 enormous, extremely similar tech stocks walking in lockstep. And in 2025, a single company, NVIDIA, was responsible for roughly 15% of the entire index's gain for the whole year. One company out of 500 drove about a sixth of everyone's returns. Here's the piece that should genuinely reshape how you view your own account. Let's say you put $10,000 into a standard S&P 500 index fund, the exact move every finance person, myself included, tells you to make. You'd assume you just bought 500 companies, nicely spread out. What you actually did was funnel around $3,200 into just those 7 giants, then scatter the remaining $6,800 across the other 493. And by the time you reach the medium-sized companies on that list, you own, and I mean this literally, a handful of dollars in each one. The 500th company gets pennies. Actual pennies. You didn't buy a diversified basket of 500 businesses. You bought 7 massive bets wearing a trench coat with the word diversification scrawled across it. Okay, so the board tracks the future, it tracks global giants, and really it's only tracking about 10 of them. But we still haven't cracked the piece that explains why Barron feels absolutely nothing, while Nikki got richer just from reading a headline. This is the part that matters most, so stick with me. Ask yourself a stupidly simple question. When the market hits a new record, who actually pockets the money? Because a record high isn't free cash showering down on the entire country. I know the headlines make it sound like a piñata just burst open over America. It didn't. It's the value of shares rising, which means it only benefits you if you actually own shares to begin with. And here's the fact that quietly explains almost everything you're feeling right now. The wealthiest 1% of American households own roughly half of every share of stock in the entire country. The top 1% alone own more stock than the bottom 90% of the country combined. Widen the lens to the top 10% of households, and they hold somewhere around 90% of all the stock that exists, leaving the bottom half of the country, half of all people owning roughly 1% of the market between them. So when that headline screams record high and the anchor sounds thrilled about it, understand what's actually happening. Those gains are landing almost entirely in accounts that already belong to people who were already wealthy. It's not that the party locks you out on purpose, it's that the party is happening inside houses you were never handed a key to. And before somebody types, "But Nick, I have a 401k, sure, plenty of people own a small slice." But watch the gap between a small slice and a massive one. The typical American with a retirement account has around $44,000 sitting in it. That's the median, the person standing dead center. And it's the honest figure, not the average that a handful of giant accounts drag way up. So when the market has a monster year and jumps 20%, that middle-of-the-pack person gains on paper maybe $8,000 or $9,000. Real money, genuinely, but it won't buy a house and it won't fix a rough month. Meanwhile, a household holding $2 million in stocks gains $400,000 in that exact same 20% move. Same market, same day, same percentage. One person got a mildly pleasant number on a screen. The other person just out-earned an entire decade of the first person's salary without lifting a finger. That right there is Nikki and Barron. That was always Nikki and Barron. So now you might be thinking, fine, the wealthy own most of it, but why does it keep climbing? Especially when things feel this rough. Shouldn't all the fear and gloom drag it down? You'd think so, but the market has a couple of engines bolted onto it that push it upward almost automatically. And once you spot them, you genuinely can't unsee them. The first engine is you, well, more specifically, your paycheck. Every 2 weeks, tens of millions of people have money automatically pulled from their paychecks and dumped straight into index funds inside their 401k. And that money buys shares regardless of the price. Nobody's checking whether the market's overpriced. Nobody's reading the news first and deciding to wait it out. It's a buyer that shows up every single payday, cash in hand, with absolutely zero opinions. Index funds now hold more than half of all the money sitting in American funds. That's a mountain of automatic, price-blind buying that simply never stops. It's like a Roomba that only knows how to purchase stocks. The building could be actively on fire, and it would still be quietly bumping into walls buying more. And here's the maddening part, that autopilot doesn't care that Barron is behind on his bills. It'll still pull his $40 this Friday, whether he thought about the market for a single second, exactly the same as it pulls Nikki's. The catch is, Nikki already has 100 times more riding on it, so the same rising tide lifts her yacht and Barron's dinghy by wildly different amounts. The second engine is companies buying back their own shares. In the last year alone, companies within the S&P 500 spent over $1 trillion, a record, repurchasing their own stock. And when a company buys back its own shares off the open market, there are suddenly fewer slices of the pie left over. So each remaining slice becomes worth a little more, and the price drifts upward. It's basically a company voting for itself with its own wallet. So between the payday autopilot and $1 trillion in buybacks, you've got this relentless, almost mechanical upward push that has very little to do with whether ordinary people are actually doing fine. There used to be a third factor too, something people nicknamed Tina. There is no alternative. For over a decade, interest rates sat basically at zero. So savings accounts and bonds paid you essentially nothing, meaning there was nowhere else to park your money except stocks. Cash flooded in because it had nowhere else to go. That excuse is mostly dead now, since bonds actually pay something again. And yet the money mostly stayed put in stocks anyway, out of pure habit and momentum, which tells you something a little unsettling. At this point, the machine keeps buying not always because it's a fantastic deal, but because it's built to keep buying regardless. And that right there is the entire engine of the frustration, isn't it? Because at the exact same moment, all this money is automatically pushing the scoreboard higher. Actual human beings are looking around thinking, wait, why does everything feel so much worse? And they're not imagining it. Consumer sentiment, which is basically a massive national survey measuring how people feel about the economy, recently hit some of the lowest readings ever recorded. Lower than the 2008 financial crisis. Lower than the darkest, most locked down days of the pandemic. People don't feel bad because they're confused or ungrateful. They feel bad because of the receipts. Prices have climbed roughly 25% since the start of 2020. That's not a typo, and it doesn't reset just because inflation cools off. That number is cumulative. The money in your pocket buys about a quarter less than it used to a few years back, and that's permanent, unless your paycheck grew to match it. And for a huge number of people, it simply didn't. It caught up to flat. And flat after everything else doesn't feel like much of a celebration. Then there's the housing scoreboard, the one people actually feel right in their chest. The median home now costs roughly 5 times the median household income. Back in the 90s, that figure sat closer to 3. The monthly payment on a typical house has roughly doubled since 2020. And the share of buyers purchasing their very first home just dropped to the lowest level ever recorded, the lowest since tracking began back in 1981. The typical first-time buyer is now 40 years old. So when somebody cheerfully tells you the economy is booming because the market hit a record and your entire lived reality is that you can't afford the exact same house your parents bought at 28, you're not wrong. And you're not bad with money. You're simply reading a completely different scoreboard than the one flashing on TV. Yours measures your life, theirs measures their assets. And look, if this is scratching some kind of itch for you, if you're the type who'd rather understand the machine than just be vaguely furious at it, that's exactly why I built a school community. It's a place where I break down exactly how I turned this kind of content into a faceless YouTube channel that keeps growing. The research, the scripting, the entire system, step by step. No gatekeeping, no upsell. If you've ever quietly thought about building something of your own out of this same curiosity, the link's in the description. Come hang out. All right, back to it, because I promised you both sides, and the honest version of this story genuinely has two. Now, everything I've said so far probably sounds like I'm winding up to scream, it's a bubble, sell everything, run for the hills. I'm not, because that would be lazy and dishonest, and the real answer is actually more uncomfortable than a crash warning. The people paying these prices aren't idiots, so let me genuinely steelman them. The bull case is genuinely strong. These massive companies sitting at the very top are nothing like the empty hype stocks from the dot-com era, the ones with a slick website, a dream, and zero actual profits. These companies print money, real, almost absurd amounts of it. The kind where a billion stops being an adjective and starts being a rounding error. Profit margins across the S&P 500 are near the highest they've ever been in recorded history. And those top 10 companies don't just make up 40% of the index's size, they generate a genuinely massive chunk of its actual earnings too. So part of that scary concentration is weirdly earned. If a small handful of companies are quietly running the digital plumbing of the entire planet while printing record profits doing it, then maybe, just maybe, paying a premium for them isn't completely insane. That's the bull case, and it honestly deserves respect. But now the bear case, and it's every bit as real. By nearly every long-term measure we have, stocks are about as expensive right now as they've ever been in history. There's a famous valuation gauge called the CAPE ratio, and right now it's sitting at its second highest reading in roughly 145 years. The only time it was ever higher was right at the peak of the dot-com bubble, moments before the whole thing collapsed. There's another gauge Warren Buffett himself is famous for favoring, one that compares the size of the entire market against the size of the entire economy. And it's currently sitting at an all-time record high. Now, none of that guarantees a crash tomorrow. Expensive markets can stay expensive for years, and anyone claiming they know the exact timing is trying to sell you something. But it does mean two boring, deeply unglamorous things are probably true. Future returns, starting from these prices, are likely to be lower than the last few wild years delivered. And if the mood ever does shift, 40% of the index balanced on 10 very similar stocks is an awful lot of eggs sitting in one extremely shiny basket. So let me collapse the whole answer into a single breath, in case you drifted off somewhere around the Roomba. The market measures the future, not your right now. It measures about 10 giant global companies, not 500. And it measures the people who own it, not the people who work for a living. Future, not now. Giants, not 500. Owners, not you. So let me pull this all the way back to Barron and to you, and give you the thing you actually showed up for, which is what any of this means for a regular human being who isn't running a hedge fund. First, record highs by themselves are not a warning siren. This matters a lot because doom is addictive and I refuse to feed it. The market has hit somewhere around 17 new record highs a year on average, dating all the way back to 1950. New highs are the normal, healthy, frankly boring default state of a market that grows over the course of decades. So if you're steadily putting money in every single month for the long haul, a record high is absolutely not your cue to panic and yank everything out. Historically, that exact move is how people lock in the very loss they were terrified of in the first place. But second, and this is the part cheerful headlines always skip, you're allowed to hold two ideas in your head at once. You can keep calmly investing while also refusing to treat the last 3 years as some kind of binding promise about the next 3. You can own the index and still know full well that underneath the costume, it's really just a handful of giants doing most of the heavy lifting. And you can quietly decide to spread things out a little more. Some international exposure, some bonds that actually pay you again now. Maybe an equal slice across all 500 companies instead of one giant lopsided bet on 7. That's not fear talking, that's simply refusing to mistake a scoreboard for a guarantee. Because here's the thing, I genuinely want you to walk away with. The stock market hitting a record high was never, ever a statement about how you specifically are doing. It was never measuring your rent, your raise, your grocery bill, or your shot at owning a home. It's a scoreboard for one particular game played mostly by people who already own the field. And the moment you truly understand that, the frustration actually loosens its grip a little because you finally stop waiting for a number on a screen to rescue a life it was never built to measure in the first place. Barron is still down in that building, still doing his grim little bill math. Nikki is still 3 floors up, still watching her number quietly climb. And the honest, slightly uncomfortable truth is that the same green arrow means 2 completely different things to the 2 of them, and it always will right up until the day Barron owns a piece of that field for himself. Because that's the actual game. It was never about timing the board or waiting for it to save you. It's about slowly, boringly, unglamorously buying your own way onto the field, one automatic paycheck at a time, until one day a record high finally means something for you too. So here's the question I'll leave you sitting with, and it's genuinely worth chewing on. If that record high was never measuring you in the first place, then what would it actually take to get you into the game it is measuring? Sit with that one. And if you want to start figuring it out alongside other people working through the exact same thing, well, you already know where to find me. It's that community. Link right down below. See you in the next one.